saying at the night's limud shvi li nishmat Avi Mori Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael, and as a refuah shlema for all of the people who are in the latest, who are still not recovered from the virus. And we begin with Parshat Matot and Massei, where tonight we're going to be talking about the last parak in Parshat Matot, which takes up all of parak Lamed Bet in a Chumash. And the first thing, and which just so you will know, is the story about the petition of the Bnei Ruvain, Bnei Gad, and ultimately we find that the Chatzi Shevet Menashe, basically the petition of those tribes that wanted to inherit the land on the east bank as opposed to the west bank. And it's interesting because in the Torah, this story is written as 4 different chapters of varying lengths. That's why you'll notice I've put a little purple here around the Samach at the end of the first chapter. In the Torah, Samach, 2nd chapter, 3rd and 4th chapters. And you'll notice that they are significantly varying in length. The first one being a short 4 psukim, the second one being 11 psukim, the third one again being a short one of 4 psukim, and then we have this rather long section at the end. So the first question is, why are the prakim divided the way they are? Because if we look at the story flow, we're going to find that it doesn't quite fit the story the way the chapter breaks are. So that's one of the things I wanted to focus a little bit. And then secondly, we're going to try to focus on what this whole story is about and what happens in the course of this story. Who learns what, who concedes what, who realizes certain things. So you'll notice, again, I've tried to color code a few things, specifically in green, introduces a discussion or a request in generally, or later on we're going to see an acceptance of the tribes that are speaking, or at least the tribal leaders, presumably, who are speaking on their behalf. The blue is going to be Moshe's response. And then we'll see a couple of key phrases that I think you'll see appear through this. So if I were a writer writing this book and dividing it into paragraphs, I would have expected that this verse 5, verse Hey, which is Vayomru, them talking to Moshe, or talking to Moshe and Elazar at this point, and the Nisiim, who the petition is addressed to, I would have expected it to be part of the first paragraph, because there they are speaking also. They put in verses 3 and 4, they begin, and then in verse 5, it seems they continue. And then I would have expected Moshe's response, which basically takes all the rest of the second chapter, to be the whole second chapter. Why is their request part of the second chapter? Because the third chapter follows very well. It's their response to Moshe's response, and perhaps their renewed request. And then the fourth chapter begins with Moshe's almost acceptance, but again, tweaking their response. They're accepting Moshe's tweaking, and then Moshe accepting but reiterating again what has been agreed to, basically what they've said and agreed to, and ultimately in the same chapter, how all of this is actualized. So if I were dividing it up, I probably would have put verse 5 in the first parak, and probably would have divided this last parak into a couple of sub-parakim, where again, Moshe responds to them, they respond to Moshe, probably Moshe responds to them, and then actually what happens should have been in its own chapter, but that's not the way the Torah divides it up. So I think there are a couple of lessons the Torah wants to teach us by focusing us on these breaks. But let's start with the story of what happened. So the first chapter, very interestingly enough, we notice the first chapter starts with the word mikneh and ends with the word mikneh. So does the first pasuk, umikneh rav, and it ends with mekom mikneh. So the Mefarshim tell us that there seems to be in this initial chapter and this initial verse a focus on the word mikneh cattle. In other words, instead of starting with the petition, it starts with this word mikneh and ends with mikneh. So the Mefarshim tell us here that there seems to be a problem, and Moshe is going to address this right away, at some point that there seems to be a problem here that these tribes seem to be focused on their cattle. That's the first thing that pops up from this. The second thing the commentaries tell us about this samach here at the end of this first parak, seemingly ending in perhaps not necessarily the place we would have expected to, is that it represents the fact that there is a pause in the dialogue. So, because there's a vayomru here, I take it back. This, I forgot to put this in green. This should have been in green. Let's put it back in green here. Okay, so they begin, they come, Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain come to Moshe and Elazar, and they say that this land that Hashem has given us, or that Hashem has caused us to take from the Amorites, is a land of Mikneh, and is a land of good grazing land, and we have lots of cattle. Period. End of discussion. They stop there. There's nothing else said. And the pasuk wants to emphasize, the Torah wants to emphasize that by putting a paragraph end here. And then it begins a new paragraph with, again, the word vayomru. They said, well, why do we need that word? If they were speaking in the last pasuk and they're speaking in the next pasuk, normal usages, we don't need it. And they said again. They continued. But the Parshat tells us that they stopped and paused here because they were looking to see if Moshe would get their hint. Their hint was, oh, we've got good grazing land. We've got tribes that have lots of cattle. Why don't we match them up? They were thinking that perhaps Moshe would make the suggestion of their own. But when Moshe didn't say anything, there's no response. There's this pregnant pause of this samach and the paragraph. They begin with their petition. If we have found favor in your eyes, then Hashem should then you should give this land to us as an inheritance, that so we don't have to cross the Yarden. Now Moshe's response perhaps is a very forceful response, certainly is, but perhaps is driven by Moshe's experience. Moshe has had experience with this people. He's been the leader for 40 years. And his first thought is to focus on these words, Al Tavi Reinu et Hayarden. We're not going to cross the Jordan.
I've lost everything. David.
Yitzhak, can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me, Yitzhak? Yitzhak, can you hear me? I guess not. Now you've lost me completely. Yitzhak, calling Yitzhak. All right, hang on a second. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, no. My whole screen is going crazy here.
I can see Itzik, but I can't see you. Now I can see you.
Yeah, so now you can see me again. Okay, all right,
Yeah.
Now I'm back. Hold on, I apologize for these technical difficulties that we are having right now. Itzik, can you hear me? Itzik, can you hear me? All right, so we are now back to where we were. I hope everybody is back, except for I need to minimize this. Okay. All right, so the words that Moshe hears and focuses on are these words, Al Tavi Reinu et Hayarden. They say we want to get this land la'achuzah as basically our possession, and we don't want to cross the Jordan. Moshe's response is very, very strong and pointed. How is it that your brothers are going to go to war and you're going to stay here? And by doing this, you are going to cause the morale of the Jewish people to be destroyed, and they will not want to cross into the land that Hashem is giving them. Moshe now launches into a very, very long history lesson. This is exactly what happened. He says to your ancestors, when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea, they went to Nachal Eshkol, they saw the land, and they demoralized the people to not want to come into the land. And again, Moshe focuses on which land? The land Asher Natan Lahem Hashem, the land that Hashem is giving us. That's the key thing that Moshe wants them to focus on. You are, by saying you want to stay back here, you are taking away from the importance of Eretz Yisrael. You're going to cause all of Bnei Yisrael not to go into Eretz Yisrael. And again, he continues with the history lesson by saying that ultimately the entire generation was not going to enter Eretz Yisrael. And he concludes by saying, look at you, you become your fathers again. You become the previous generation, and you're going to again cause Hashem to become angry, and we're not going to get into Eretz Yisrael. And with that, the paragraph ends because Moshe has not addressed their request at all. He hasn't said yes, he hasn't said no. All he has said is that how can you even think of not going into Eretz Yisrael? Because that's what we've been waiting 40 years for. Moshe himself has been denied that privilege, and he says, well, how can anybody pass up that privilege? What are you thinking? So clearly on that point, this paragraph ends because Moshe has basically said, forget it, it's a non-starter. And we see from the next chapter again, that Vayikshu Elav, they now have to reapproach him almost with a new request. They have to rethink their request, but they come forward and now they begin their second attempt at a request here. Here they say, Gitrotzon nivneh lemikneinu po v'yarim l'tapenu. Okay, Moshe, you misunderstood us. We had no intention of meaning that we weren't going to go and fight. We will build the proper things, corrals for our sheep, cities for our children, and we will accept our responsibility. Not only will we go up and fight, but we will go lifnei b'nei Yisrael. We will be in the vanguard. We will lead the fight until we have brought them into their place. Our children will live in these fortified cities we're going to build for them. And we're not going to return home ad hitnachel b'nei Yisrael ish nachalato, they say. So all of the Jewish people have inherited their inheritance. Okay? Clearly, a very, very powerful request. But again, Moshe's not happy with this for two specific accounts we're going to see. Number one, Moshe says, wait a minute. What does it mean? You're going to go into Havionim. We're going to bring them into their place. No. Moshe says, now look at the words that appear every time Moshe says anything. What is it? If you will go and fight for, again, keywords here, Lifnei Hashem. Notice this two-word phrase appears 4 times in the next Sukkim, as Moshe is reminding them what their responsibility is. Their responsibility is very, very clear here. You're not going to fight because you're so strong and you're the warriors. Yes, you want to go in the front, that's wonderful. But this is not your fight. Lifnei Hashem. We're going to fight before Hashem. Again, when you will cross the Yarden, it will be Lifnei Hashem, before Hashem. And who is going to inherit the land? Ad Horisho. Not that you are going to beat the enemies. Hashem is going to stand by you and beat these enemies for you. The land will be conquered again, Lifnei Hashem, before Hashem. And then Achar Teshuva, then you can return. And then again, Lifnei Hashem. Notice what was missing here in their request. No mention at all of Hashem. No mention at all of any part that Hashem plays in this. So at least now Moshe, again, hasn't really addressed their request. Can they have the land until the last point? He says, again, he wants them to understand that this is not about politics. It's not about anything. It's about belief in Hashem. And you have to understand that, when we're going to fight because Hashem is sending us to fight. When the land is conquered, it will be Hashem is the one who will allow us to conquer it. And then even when you come back here and inherit this land as your possession, it's Lifnei Hashem. Don't forget, don't think, we're strong enough on our own to fight off all our enemies. It's Lifnei Hashem. But if they don't do that, okay, and then without a new paragraph break, again, we continue by Yom Rubenei God of Nei Ruvain El Moshe Lemor. They respond to Moshe saying, we're good. That's great, Moshe. We agree to everything you say. We're going to do everything you've asked. Not only that, they mentioned Lifnei Hashem. They got it right. They understand exactly what's going on. That it's before Hashem. This entire thing is before Hashem. One other comment that Moshe makes here is notice that they say they are going to build corrals for their sheep, and then they're going to build cities for their children. And Moshe says, no, not quite. We're not finished yet, okay? He says, Binu lachem arim letapchem. When you build, you're going to build the cities for your children first. That's more important. You can build corrals for your sheep, but only after you've worried about your children. The most important thing in the continuity of the Jewish people is not how much sheep we have and how rich we are. It's how we raise our children. The Arim L'Tavchem has to come first. The focus on our children, our families, the future has to be before our focus on money. That's what Moshe reminds them, in addition to the fact that we have to focus on the fact that it's Hashem who is fighting with us, giving us the land, etc. So there are these two lessons Moshe takes, and they get them both. It says, firstly, Tapenu Nashenu, they say, you're right. You said we got to focus on our children and our wives first, families first, and then we'll worry about our cattle. And then we will go in front, Lifnei Hashem. So again, this key two lessons that Moshe wants them to get, it seems that they got, because when they state their acceptance of Moshe's request, of Moshe's acceptance of their request with conditions, they restate Moshe's exact conditions, that the children come before the cattle and that we have to have Hashem in mind. And so Moshe now reiterates the entire procedure. He says, again, he tells not just them, but he tells them in front of Elazar HaKohen and Yoshua bin Nun and the leaders of the tribes, he tells the following: if they will, okay, and then they will, then they can have the land on the east bank as their possession. But if not, then they will get possession in the west bank. So there is a double-sided. Moshe reiterates the condition exactly as it was stated, that this is what if they do this, this will happen. If they don't do this, this will happen. The Gemara derives all of conditional law. All laws of stating a specific condition are based on these two psukim that Moshe says back to them, Pasuk Chavtet and Pasuk Lamed, that whenever you want to have a proper condition in law, you have to say, if this, then this, and if not this, then this, in that order, according to some of the Parshanim and some of the opinions in the Gemara. Says it has to be exactly in that order, otherwise it's not a valid condition. By the way, we look in Pasuk Lamed Aleph and Lamed Bet, they accept it, and they add one little thing: that which Hashem has told us, we will do. We will pass in front before Hashem, knowing that we will inherit this land on the east bank when we are successful. And then with the Pasuk Lamed Gimel tells us how Moshe gave them this land, they built it all up. All of this is contained in the same, as I said, the same chapter. Ultimately, that they inherit, that they take possession of this land temporarily, building cities for their children, corrals for their sheep. And ultimately, we'll read in the book of Yoshua that they do fulfill the condition. They do go as in the vanguard of the fighting, and they wait until all of Eretz Yisrael has been conquered, and ultimately they return to the land that they have inherited. But we see from here, Moshe very, very forcefully making sure that the request is made with the proper conditions, that the request is focused on the proper focus. And that really is why this parsha seems to be so long of a dialogue between these two tribal leaders and Moshe, again, going back and forth, focusing on the different issues. I wanted to close with, it's very interesting because if we go through Jewish history, we will find that these 2.5 tribes that settled on the East Bank were the first of the tribes to be exiled 700 years later after Yeshua. And Dasakain, Tosfot, and Rashi make some very interesting comments on this. Number one, Rashi says very simply that when they say they want to build corrals, as I mentioned before, Chasim hayu al mamonim yosef ibneim bibnotehem, sheikdimu mikneim litapam. they cared more at the beginning. They had more focus on their money than their children. And that's why that was their focus. And Moshe corrected them. And Tosfos goes into a very long. Das Games has a very, very interesting take on this. He says, firstly, the top parsha, as I said, begins with the word umikne rav, that they had lots of cattle. And Ra and Tosad Lefisha Hayu Ashirim Biyoter, since they were so wealthy, Chibabu Mimonam, they had great love for their possessions, their money. Ubishvil Chivu Bimonam Pirshumeacheha. Because of this focus on their money, they ended up separating from the rest of their brothers. In other words, they stayed on the East Bank, everybody else was the West Bank. V'yashvul chutz le'eretz Yisrael. Interestingly enough, Tosfos wants to say that the East Bank is not Eretz Yisrael proper, not to be confused with the West Bank, which certainly is, but they wanted to live outside of Eretz Yisrael, ulefikach, and because of that, galut tchila lechol hashvatim, shenemar vayikleim yulevim v'lakadilach t'shevet hamnasher. They were the first tribes to be exiled at the end of the first Commonwealth period. They are exiled before the rest of the 10 tribes, and ultimately before Yehuda and Binyamin are exiled too. And Tosfos adds at the end, he says, he brings a mamar from Chazal. He says, we have to understand there are shalosh matanot bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamo. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has 3 special gifts that he gives people. And they are chachma, wisdom, gvura, strength, and osher, riches. And interestingly enough, that all of these are gifts. We tend to think that wisdom, that strength, that riches are things that we accomplish. And Tosfos wants to tell us absolutely not. That nothing could be further from the truth. Quotes this Gemara in Nida. Shemalach echad memuna al ha'hirayon. There is an angel who is in charge of all pregnancies. The Laila Shema, whatever his name of this angel is. Who maybe hatipalif ne'akadosh baruch hu v'omer. He brings this drop that's about to fertilize the egg before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he says, Tipa zu mati yala, this a cell that is going to fertilize the egg, what is going to be its destiny? Chacham o tipesh, is it going to be wise or foolish? Gibor o chalash, strong or weak? Ani o ashir, rich or poor? So we see that these 3 attributes of wisdom, strength, and riches are not something that we accomplish. There's something that is destined or preordained by us, by Hashem. Aval, Rasha v'tzadik lo ka'amar. The Malach can't ask God, is this person going to be a Rasha or a tzaddik? Ki adavar talui b'rtzono shel adam. Ki damrina nakol b'dei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim. This is all up to each person, each individual, that we see that everything is in the hands of Hashem. All of these things, whether you'll be rich, poor, smart, wise, or foolish, that's in the hands of Hashem. What's in your hands is what you do with those talents. And that's why he brings down the pasuk that says, Al yitalel chacham mechachmato, the wise man shouldn't take any great pride in his wisdom, shari nigzar alav miyom shenotar, because that was already decreed. And it's interesting that he then ends with the story of Korach and Haman, who were both fabulously wealthy people who did not appreciate that this was a gift from Hashem and did not use their wealth properly and ultimately were destroyed. He says, similarly, that could possibly apply back to where we started, to these 2.5 tribes who were granted great wealth by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and unfortunately failed to appreciate it and ultimately caused their own exile before the rest of the tribes. So we have a couple of very powerful, I think, lessons here from this parasha. First and foremost, clearly, that our most precious possession is not our money, it's not our house, it's not our car, it's not our stock portfolio, it's our children and our grandchildren, and making sure that we focus them as we should be focused ourselves on the fact that it is our duty to try to use the tools and talents that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us, the resources that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has granted us to serve Hashem. And when we do that, and we are lifnei Hashem in all of that we focus on, we are sure that we will be successful in whatever we do. And ultimately, we will be successful in teaching all of the world about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and being Zocha to Gula Shlema B'Meher V'Yameinu.
Very good.
Thank you all. I open the floor up for questions, comments, and